The Book of Job is a book found in the Ketuvim writings section of the Hebrew Bible and the first of the poetic books in the Old Testament of the Christian Bible. The language of the Book of Job, combining post-Babylonian Hebrew and Aramaic influences, indicates it was composed during the Persian period, 540 to 330 before Christ, with the poet using Hebrew in a learned, literary manner. It addresses the problem of evil, providing a theodicy through the experiences of the eponymous protagonist. It is structured with a prose prologue and epilogue framing poetic dialogues and monologues, including 3 cycles of debates between Job and his friends, Job's Lamentations, the poem to Wisdom, Elihu's speeches, and God's 2 speeches from a whirlwind. Job is a wealthy God-fearing man with a comfortable life and a large family. God discusses Job's piety with a character called the adversary, Satan. The adversary rebukes God, stating that Job would turn away from God if he were to lose everything within his possession. God decides to test that theory by allowing the adversary to inflict pain on Job. Job is tested through extreme suffering, including the loss of his wealth, children, and health, yet he maintains his piety while challenging the justice of God. Job defends himself against his unsympathetic friends, whom God admonishes. The dialogues explore human frailty and the inaccessibility of divine wisdom, culminating in God highlighting his omnipotence and Job confessing his limited understanding. Job's fortunes and family are restored in the epilogue. The character Job appears in the 6th century before Christ Book of Ezekiel as an exemplary righteous man of antiquity, and the author of the Book of Job has apparently chosen this legendary hero for his parable. The language of the Book of Job, combining post-Babylonian Hebrew and Aramaic influences, indicates it was composed during the Persian period, 540 to 330 before Christ, with the poet using Hebrew in a learned, literary manner. The anonymous author was almost certainly an Israelite, although the story is set outside Israel, in southern Edom or northern Arabia, and alludes to places as far apart as Mesopotamia and Egypt. Despite the Israelite origins, it appears that the Book of Job was composed in a time in which wisdom literature was common but not acceptable to Judean sensibilities, during the Babylonian exile and shortly thereafter. The speeches of Elihu differ in style from the rest of the book, and neither God nor Job appear to take any note of what he has said. As a result, it is widely believed that Elihu's speeches are a later addition by another author. The language of Job stands out for its conservative spelling and exceptionally large number of words and word forms not found elsewhere in the Bible. Many later scholars, down to the 20th century, have looked for an Aramaic, Arabic, or Edomite origin, but a close analysis suggests that the foreign words and foreign-looking forms are literary affectations designed to lend authenticity to the book's distant setting and give it a foreign flavor. Job exists in a number of forms: the Hebrew Masoretic text, which underlies many modern Bible translations, the Greek Septuagint made in Egypt in the last centuries before Christ, and Aramaic and Hebrew manuscripts found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the Latin Vulgate, the New Revised Standard Version, and in Protestant Bibles, it is placed after the Book of Esther as the first of the poetic books. In the Hebrew Bible, it is located within the Ketuvim. John Hartley notes that in Sephardic manuscripts, the texts are ordered as Psalms, Job, and Proverbs, but in Ashkenazic texts, the order is Psalms, Proverbs, and then Job. In the Catholic Jerusalem Bible, it is described as the first of the wisdom books and follows the 2 books of the Maccabees. The book has influenced Jewish and Christian theology and liturgy, as well as Western culture. It parallels wisdom traditions from Mesopotamia and Egypt. In Islam, Job is revered as a prophet exemplifying steadfast faith. Job, Ecclesiastes, and the Book of Proverbs belong to the genre of wisdom literature, sharing a perspective that they themselves call the way of wisdom. Wisdom means both a way of thinking and a body of knowledge gained through such thinking, as well as the ability to apply it to life. In its biblical application in wisdom literature, it is seen as attainable in part through human effort and in part as a gift from God, but never in its entirety, except by God. The three books of wisdom literature share attitudes and assumptions but differ in their conclusions. Proverbs makes confident statements about the world and its workings that Job and Ecclesiastes flatly contradict. Wisdom literature from Sumeria and Babylonia can be dated to the 3rd millennium before Christ. Several texts from ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt offer parallels to Job, and while it is impossible to tell whether any of them influenced the author of Job, their existence suggests that the author was the recipient of a long tradition of reflection on the existence of inexplicable suffering. The Book of Job is an investigation of the problem of divine justice. This problem, known in theology as the problem of evil or Theodicy, can be rephrased as a question: why do the righteous suffer? The conventional answer in ancient Israel was that God rewards virtue and punishes sin, the principle known as retributive justice. According to this view, the moral status of human choices and actions is consequential, but experience demonstrates that suffering is experienced by those who are good. The biblical concept of righteousness was rooted in the covenant-making God who had ordered creation for communal well-being, and the righteous were those who invested in the community, showing special concern for the poor and needy. Their antithesis were the wicked, who were selfish and greedy. The Satan, or the adversary, raises the question of whether there is such a thing as disinterested righteousness. If God rewards righteousness with prosperity, will men not act righteously from selfish motives? He asks God to test this by removing the prosperity of Job, the most righteous of all God's servants. The book begins with a frame narrative, giving the reader an omniscient God's-eye perspective which introduces Job as a man of exemplary faith and piety, blameless and upright, who fears God and shuns evil. The contrast between the frame and the poetic dialogues and monologues, in which Job never learns of the opening scenes in heaven or of the reason for his suffering, creates a sense of dramatic irony between the divine view of the adversary's wager and the human view of Job's suffering without any reason. In the poetic dialogues, Job's friends see his suffering and assume he must be guilty, since God is just. Job, knowing he is innocent, concludes that God must be unjust. He retains his piety throughout the story, contradicting the adversary's suspicion that his righteousness is due to the expectation of reward, but makes clear from his first speech that he agrees with his friends that God should and does reward righteousness. The intruder, Elihu, rejects the arguments of both parties. Job is wrong to accuse God of injustice, as God is greater than human beings, and the visitors are not correct either, for suffering, far from being a punishment, may rescue the afflicted from their affliction. That is, suffering can make those afflicted more amenable to revelation, literally, open their ears, Job 36 verse 15. Chapter 28, the poem, or hymn, to wisdom, introduces another theme, divine wisdom. The hymn does not place any emphasis on retributive justice, stressing instead the inaccessibility of wisdom. Wisdom cannot be invented or purchased, it says, God alone knows the meaning of the world, and he grants it only to those who live in reverence before him. God possesses wisdom because he grasps the complexities of the world, Job 28 verses 24 to 26, a theme which anticipates God's speech in chapters 38 to 41, with its repeated refrain, "Where were you when?" When God finally speaks, he neither explains the reason for Job's suffering, known to the reader to be unjust, from the prologue set in heaven, nor defends his justice. The first speech focuses on his role in maintaining order in the universe. The list of things that God does and Job cannot do demonstrates divine wisdom because order is the heart of wisdom. Job then confesses his lack of wisdom, meaning his lack of understanding of the workings of the cosmos and of the ability to maintain it. The second speech concerns God's role in controlling the formidable behemoth and Leviathan. Job's reply to God's final speech is longer than his first and more complicated. The usual view is that he admits to being wrong to challenge God and now repents in dust and ashes, Job 42 verse 6, but the Hebrew is difficult. An alternative reading is that Job says he was wrong to repent and mourn, and does not retract any of his arguments. In the concluding part of the frame narrative, God restores and increases Job's prosperity, indicating that the divine policy on retributive justice remains unchanged. In the Second Temple period, the character of Job began to be transformed into something more patient and steadfast, with his suffering a test of virtue and a vindication of righteousness for the glory of God. The process of sanctifying Job began with the Greek Septuagint translation and was furthered in the apocryphal Testament of Job, which makes him the hero of patience. This reading pays little attention to the Job of the dialogue sections of the book, but it was the tradition taken up by the Epistle of James in the New Testament, which presents Job as one whose patience and endurance should be emulated by believers, James 5 verses 7 to 11. When Christians began interpreting Job 19 verses 23 to 29, verses concerning a Redeemer who Job hopes can save him from God's wrath, as a prophecy of Christ, the predominant Jewish view became Job the blasphemer, with some rabbis even saying that he was rightly punished by God because he had stood by while Pharaoh massacred the innocent Jewish infants. Augustine of Hippo recorded that Job had prophesied the coming of Christ, and Pope Gregory I offered him as a model of right living worthy of respect. The medieval Jewish scholar Maimonides declared his story a parable, and the medieval Christian Thomas Aquinas wrote a detailed commentary declaring it true history. In the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther explained how Job's confession of sinfulness and worthlessness underlay his saintliness, and John Calvin's interpretation of Job demonstrated the doctrine of the resurrection and the ultimate certainty of divine justice. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the Moses Film channel and give the video a thumbs up in support.